I have a confession to make. In my last video, I made a statement that was entirely untrue. I said that my last NFL mock draft was nearly the most accurate mock draft in the world. And it turns out that's an entirely untrue statement. No, it actually is the most accurate mock draft in the world. Yeah, I know. Rude. My full apology and any other details you might need to know after this on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. And yes, it's been a very weird week for me. As you know, this is very much a fantasy football challenge, but every year I also try my hand at mock drafting, mainly because I find it fun. I think it's an interesting way of having a break from fantasy football for a few months. And as it turns out, I've gotten pretty good at it because this year I officially, according to Fantasy Pros, had the most accurate mock draft. In fact, I would have had the most accurate mock draft according to the Huddle Report, which is the other official mock draft ranker, if I just submitted the right mock draft. I made two mock drafts. I submitted one of them to the Huddle Report, thinking it was a good idea. Then overnight, I rethought it and changed it around a little bit, submitted the other one to Fantasy Pros. And if I'd submitted that one to the Huddle Report, would have won their competition as well. Feeling kind of silly for that, but very happy to have gotten this success in the Fantasy Pros competition. This means over the last 3 years combined, I'm officially the second most accurate mock drafter behind the king of mock drafting, Jason Boris, and not by very much, as you can see. But this year, I finally got one over him and got first place for the first time. So very exciting. And today, I thought I'd just take you through what happened, where I got all my information for each of the picks, why I made those decisions, and also have a look at how I ranked each drafted player in the first round over the 8 mock drafts that I did. I did my first mock draft way back in January, then did one each month after that until April, when I did one a week. And then I, of course, entered 2 in the week of the actual draft. One the night before, which was, of course, for the Huddle Report. Unfortunately, I had to enter that one while I'm at work because your evening is during the day for me, and I was at work. And then, of course, the next day, which was thankfully a public holiday for me, I was able to actually go through properly, make a few last-minute edits, and change my mock draft right before the actual draft. And as it turns out, it went very well. So let's look through the draft. Let's look at what I originally thought was going to happen and how I ended up coming to my end decisions. Hopefully this won't take too long. I don't want to take up too much of your valuable time. And the number one pick was, of course, Cam Ward. And we saw this coming from a long way away. But right back in January, I still had Shedeur Sanders up the top. I felt like he was more of a safe prospect. Cam Ward had a couple of dings coming out of college. He was more of a growing prospect that had some clear red flags with his technique and his play style. But as it turns out, his process through the combine and through the pro days and everything else was very, very impressive. And most of those red flags were put to bed, while Shedeur Sanders managed to create a whole heap of his own and really highlighted a lot of the issues with his play, his lack of pocket presence, etc. I know a lot of people initially were mocking Travis Hunter or alternatively Abdul Carter for the Titans. For me, it was obviously always going to be a quarterback, and that became obvious in particular after free agency when they didn't bring up a quarterback. So you can see that on the screen, you can see that I've mocked them a quarterback every single time, and you can see where I predicted Cam Ward would go. He was always a top 2 player for me. Travis Hunter's an interesting one. Obviously, he was always going to be a top 4 option. I originally had him behind both Sanders and Ward. Then it became obvious to me that he was going to go ahead of Abdul Carter. We had that news come out from a lot of different people in the know that caused the odds to shift in particular. And when odds shift very drastically, it either means that a couple of particularly famous mock drafters have changed something or that we have some actual legitimate news coming out. And in that case, I was pretty confident there was actually going to be a proper change, and that it did seem like people in the know believed it would be Hunter. I still thought there was a possibility it would be Carter because we were hearing things from insiders. I get a lot of good information from the guys over at Walter Football, Waltz and Charlie Campbell. Definitely check out their site. And also the likes of Tony Pauline and Albert Breer are pretty good. So a lot of information suggesting maybe it wasn't a done deal yet, but Hunter always seemed the most likely after the interviews and pro days came through. You'll also notice that in this case, that's who I mocked to the Jaguars. The Jaguars, someone I found particularly difficult to mock. I thought defensive tackle made the most sense. They just had nothing at defensive tackle. But then we had reports coming out from Charlie that potentially they didn't view defensive tackle as being a premium position. So I gave him a quarterback instead. And then Will Johnson, of course, had some issues with injuries and also just had a terrible, really pre-draft process and dropped down a lot. And so in the end, I shifted across to running back. And then, of course, they traded up and screwed everybody's mock drafts and bets. Cost me a lot of money as well in bets because obviously that caused everything else to shift down as well. Messed up everybody's mock drafts, but luckily it all cancelled out by the time we got to about the 7th pick. At 3, Abdul Carter for me always belongs somewhere in this range after I'd gone through the initial part of the process. I originally had him down at 7 because I just didn't know that any of the earlier teams had a clear need there. And I felt like there were more clear needs a little bit earlier on, especially with the Giants in particular. I felt like they'd be more inclined to go for a cornerback or a quarterback. And then it became obvious that Sanders wasn't going to be the pick for them, but also that Hunter was going to be gone. So Carter kind of became the only option, which is why I ended up giving them Carter towards the end of the process. You'll also notice, by the way, that in my final mock draft, I also had Jackson Dart in at 32. I didn't think particularly that he would necessarily go at 32. I was finding it particularly difficult to work out what the Eagles are going to do. And I did feel like that a team was going to trade up for Dart or Sanders. Originally, I thought it might be Sanders, but then it became evident that Sanders was going to drop. And so I did it with Dart instead. And it seemed like the Giants were the most likely to do it, which turned out to be the correct call, even though they did a little bit earlier. I nearly did it with the Vikings as well. I nearly had the Vikings trading out, which would have done even better for my mock draft because it would have had Dart going in roughly the right area. But as it turns out, it was the Texans that dropped down. Anyway, so Carter, very clearly a top 3 prospect once we went through the process. So good to see him go in that correct spot. Will Campbell was always my favorite O-lineman throughout the process, but I did have the impression this O-line class was quite weak, and they are. There's not a lot of clear tackle prospects, which is why I had Campbell lower down. I felt like he was probably going to make it to the Bears, who I felt like really needed O-line help. Of course, in free agency, they then brought in a whole heap of O-linemen, which kind of allowed me to shift that idea. But I did feel like the Pats were more likely to address the secondary initially when Hunter was available, maybe go a wide receiver before they brought Diggs in. But then it became very clear that we had news that Will Campbell was definitely the guy. That was another Charlie Campbell pull. He was very clear that it was definitely going to be Will Campbell, and that became evident a couple of weeks out, but not before I could put some pretty good bets on Will Campbell going to the Pats, which was a lot of fun. Mason Graham, of course, went at 5, and that's what we originally expected. It did seem like Graham was probably going to go in that region. In fact, that's where I mocked him in my very first mock draft. Of course, that was to the Jaguars because I felt like that was a need there. If I'd known the Browns were going to go there, I probably wouldn't have put Graham here. I think there were probably other options I thought made most sense. Initially, of course, I had the Browns going for Wood when I thought that he was going to be available. Then it became very clear that Sanders wasn't going to be the right option for them. So I was giving them Carter and then eventually Hunter, as we know. I did also mock them Sanders at 32 at one stage because I thought there was a good chance they'd trade up. But as it turns out, that seemed unlikely as time went on based on the guys that they brought in. Mason Graham was someone I really struggled with. Originally, I thought there was a good chance he would go top 5. And then I started hearing things about issues around his body shape. I was concerned about how much his play would transfer across. I started to wonder about whether he would actually be able to produce in the same way in the pros. And ultimately ended up actually moving him down as far as 11 because I did start to hear some noise that maybe he was going to drop. And I think potentially he would have if the Browns hadn't moved down, because I don't think the Jags were going to take him. And I also think that the Raiders were probably going to take Membu. And then I think probably that the Jets were either going to take Banks or one of the tight ends. Graham was still an option there. I did like the idea of giving Graham to the Jets, and I nearly did in my final mock, but I started to hear a lot about Warren potentially going there, and that pushed Graham down a lot further for me, all the way, in fact, to 11. And the reason I mocked him at 11 is because I heard the 49ers really like Walter Nolan, and for that reason, I thought if I mocked Graham there, potentially I get him in roughly the right range. Plus, I still get the points for them in the Fantasy Pros comp for them taking a tight end. A defensive tackle, I should say. If it's not Graham that goes there, but it's Nolan instead. So it's kind of a two birds with one stone situation. At the 6th spot, Ashton Genty. This is, of course, where we thought he was going to go at one stage. My initial instinct was that he was going to go to the Cowboys, but he just continued to rise through the process. I had real concerns about whether he'd be able to transfer what he did it really at a smaller school to the NFL. I think they were put to bed through the combine process and everything else. I think he did look very good there. Kind of allayed a lot of my concerns. And we also saw there were a lot of holes in a lot of the other players that I had ranked high initially. I did originally have Will Johnson going here, for example. I do still think they really needed cornerback help and they should have done better with that. I also had McMillan here at one point because I always felt like McMillan was potentially a top 5 or top 6 player. His lack of separation ability is the reason I dropped McMillan out of this spot eventually and went for someone like a Genty. Once it seemed like Genty was going to go at 5, it did seem like Membu was definitely going to be the pick here, and I think he probably still would have. Though, interestingly, a couple of hours out from the draft, we started to hear news coming through that maybe Pete Carroll saying it would be Kelvin Banks. I think that was smoke. I do think it probably would have been Membu if Genty hadn't reached this point. We had news from Charlie Campbell that suggested that it would be Genty if he was there, and if not, it would be Membu. No one expected Genty to be there, but after that trade happened, which kind of came through at the last minute and seemed like fake news at the time, obviously that's how Membu ended up slipping an extra spot. And I did actually have Membu in this spot quite often. Throughout April, really, I had Membu in this spot until the last couple of days when it became evident that Genty was probably going to go at 5 and that Membu would hence go at 6. I don't love this pick. I personally think it made a little bit more sense to go defensive tackle, but I do understand they do want to protect Justin Fields and make it easy for him, and giving them either a tight end or a tackle made more sense. Certainly in one of my mocks, or in quite a few of my mocks, I thought Membu would go here, but I figured if I mocked him at 6, then I also get the option of the possibility they go Tyler Warren. We did hear that if Membu wasn't there, that Warren was probably going to be the pick, that it could potentially still be Banks or maybe even Colston Loveland. So it did end up making sense to go Warren in my final mock, but that's because I had Membu at 6. And if I hadn't taken Membu at 6, I think Membu probably goes here. I did consider keeping it as Mason Graham, but I started to hear that was becoming a less likely option for them because it wasn't quite as much of a need to them. They wanted to really work on the offense. And that's, of course, what they ended up doing. At 8, this was a real shock for me. I had them going edge throughout the whole process. For me, the Panthers' greatest need was on defense. I think probably if there were better cornerbacks around, I might have considered that as well. But to me, edge was the greatest need. I did consider Mason Graham here as well because he was falling, but I just felt like that they loved Jelon Walker. We knew that throughout the process. We'd had cleared reports from insiders that definitely Walker was someone they liked. Of course, I personally like Micah Williams as well. That's who I personally would have liked here. I originally had James Pierce, of course, before the character concerns became a major issue that we all became aware of. But yeah, it should have been Walker here. I think that was the correct pick. But the odds did switch a lot in the last 24 hours. And I nearly switched this to McMillan. I was actually kind of tossing it up in the half an hour before this needed to be entered. But I did end up going with Walker because it just made more sense for me. As it turns out, McMillan was the pick, and I don't agree with it. The more I looked at him through the process, I started to feel like this really wasn't the right fit. I don't think he's that different from Xavier Legette, for starters. Secondly, I feel like their offense is kind of okay as it is at the moment, but their defense is very poor, and they need to sort that out before they really go back and sort the offense out as well. In at 9, Kelvin Banks. This is a little bit of a surprise to me simply because I didn't think it's what the Saints were going to do, but I didn't really have any idea what the Saints were going to do. I was giving them all sorts of random players. The general feeling was that we just could not work out what was going on with the Saints. Whenever I talked to any other draft experts, there was just a general question of what are the Saints going to do? They were keeping it very, very, very cagey. And it is a question of what they would have done if Kelvin Banks wasn't here. And I don't know the answer to that question even. Because there was the possibility that all 3 offensive tackles were off the board, and I don't think they were going to go for another OT. So it would have been interesting to see who fell and then who they would have taken. There was, of course, talk at one stage that would be quarterback. I did give him Sanders at one point, but I moved that out pretty much immediately because it became evident pretty quickly that that was not going to occur and that they liked him more as a second round option, or at least liked the idea of a quarterback as a second round option. Banks for me was always someone who was kind of on the edge of the top 10. I gave him to the Dolphins and 49ers a lot because they had such a strict O-line need and a major O-line need. I ended up giving him to the Bears, I think, in the end. And the reason I gave him to the Bears is because I felt really confident he was going to go in that 9, 10, 11 range. I was pretty confident it would be somewhere in that patch of picks, and I wanted him smack bang in the middle. Plus, I already had Warren going to the Jets, so there was a more natural fit there. And as it turns out, he went to 9, so it all worked out pretty nicely. Then, of course, the real shock, Colston Loveland going at 10 to the Bears. I say this is a shock. People who watch my videos will remember me being pretty low on Tyler Warren throughout. I didn't personally think he deserved to be a high first-round pick. I still don't. I think even at 14, he might be disappointing. I also don't think Colston Loveland belongs this high either, but I did personally think that Loveland could arguably be ahead of Warren, so it didn't shock me entirely when the Bears made this pick. I do feel like Loveland's a little bit more like Komet than Warren is, which is a little bit of a weird choice, but it still kind of made sense to me. I understood what they were doing. I did know that they were possibly going to go tight end, which is why I mocked them Warren so often. I still think that offensive tackle made more sense for them. I don't think that the guys they brought in were quite right to play tackle, especially not long term. So I was happier when they had Campbell, but even when Banks was available, I think I would have given them him to them. And I do wonder if Banks had gotten past the Saints, whether they took Banks here. I felt like this was a very viable landing spot. As for Loveland, I didn't even have him in my original mock draft. He was kind of on the edge of the first round for me. And then as the pre-draft process happened, started looking into him a little bit more, started to become a lot more comfortable with the idea of him going earlier, but I never saw top 10 going. This was a bit of a surprise to me. I thought he was more likely to see Warren top 10 and then see the Colts take Loveland at 14, which is where I mocked him throughout April. Micah Williams going at 11, ahead of Jalen Walker. This is really interesting to me, but not surprising to me. While I did have Walker mocked earlier a lot of the time, I actually preferred Williams. Williams is someone I liked throughout this process. In fact, I mocked Williams to this exact spot in my original draft, and I only had him behind James Pierce because Pierce is just a more explosive and impressive edge rusher, but those character issues very quickly made me drop Pierce down. I then ultimately moved Williams all the way up to the Panthers spot at 8. He then kind of bounced it around between the Panthers and Falcons, who I felt were going to be the next team to take an edge rusher. In fact, I forgot to change the graphic to say this is an edge rusher. Of course, Williams is an edge rusher. But in the end, it made sense for San Fran to take one here. I always thought the D-line was an option. I thought it was D-line or O-line with the outside chance of a quarterback. When Will Johnson fell, it was obviously going to be O-line or D-line, and none of the O-linemen made it. So they kind of had to go D-line. Graham wasn't there, so Williams was a natural fit. Kind of surprised they didn't go Walker. I have heard some really good things about his character in particular, but I just feel like Williams is such a safe pick, and it does make sense for the 49ers here. So I've got no arguments. This is certainly the range I expected him to go, and if he made it past the Saints. This was the first real shock for me. I was very confident that the Cowboys were going to go some sort of position player, be it running back or wide receiver, maybe even a tight end, if neither of those two options were available. And I didn't think it was going to be Tyler Booker. I did hear some really good things about Tyler Booker, particularly character stuff, but this guy's not a majorly good athlete. He's just a really good, solid guard. Very, very, very solid, but that's the kind of guy that you expect to go late in the first round. I did have some conversations with Walls in particular about the idea that guards would probably rise due to guard contracts increasing in value, and therefore teams are going to take guards earlier in the draft because they're seeing an increase in value relative to other positions. As it turns out, that happened because Booker went very early, and that was a real surprise to me. We heard a lot about teams like the Lions and the Commanders and potentially and plenty of other guys in those late 20s thinking there was a real chance that Booker would fall to them and being quite surprised when he wasn't there. So going at 12, this was really the shocker of the draft. I'm still kind of surprised that they didn't attack running back at all. I don't think once Genty was off that it made sense to go Hampton here. And once McMillan was gone, I didn't really expect them to go Golden. So I guess that kind of forced their hand a little bit. And maybe this is a bit of a panic pick. But I do think that there were better options on the board they could have taken, even if they weren't positional fits, because Booker, this is just way too early for him. At 13, Kenneth Grant, I bounced around all over the place with him. Originally, I had him very high because I'm really a big fan of the talent. Then I started to hear a lot of reports suggesting that maybe teams view him as more of a nose tackle, and nose tackles just don't go this high in the draft. So I was kind of pushing him down into the 20s and considered moving him even lower. In fact, I started to feel like maybe the Chargers was kind of his floor because we know that he's loved by Jim Harbaugh. As it turns out, going at 13, and I like this for the Dolphins. I actually think it's a pretty solid pick. It's just a question of how much pressure they're going to get on the quarterback from him. I always thought the tackle was an option. I mocked them Mason Graham at one point in time. Of course, none of the OTs are here. And while we heard that they liked Jahdae Barron, I didn't like that pick at all. I understand the cornerback is a massive need with Jalen Ramsey out, but so I mocked them one because I do understand it's a need, but I thought this was too early for Barron, who really is more of kind of like a nickel slot kind of guy. And Will Johnson, of course, was falling by that point in time. So Grant makes perfect sense. Was never going to really mock him here later in the process, but very happy to see him go in this point. I feel like this makes sense. Kind of surprised he went ahead of Walter Nolan. I'll talk about Nolan in a second. Tyler Warren at 14. Mocked him here a couple of times in the process and basically gave him a tight end the whole way through. Originally flirted with the idea of a cornerback, but it just became really evident that they wanted a tight end. I don't know why they were so desperate for a tight end, but it did become very obvious this was going to happen. I'm not a big fan of Warren. I had him going towards the end of the first round initially based on pure instincts. My first mock is more based on what I thought should happen. And then I started to get a lot more involved in what the teams were actually going to do. And it became evident that they did see him as a first half of the first round kind of guy, which is why I kept shifting him up. And we did hear a lot about the Jets potentially taking him. And maybe they would have if their guy wasn't there in Membu. So as it turns out, falls to 14 because the Bears were not as enthused. And I think that's okay. I'm okay with this spot. I don't really think it's the best fit, but the other option for the Colts was Tyler Booker, and he was off the board anyway, shockingly enough. So made sense to go Warren here. I'm totally okay with that. This was the big fall, Jelon Walker, and I'm kind of surprised no team jumped up to go get him. But the Falcons were always going to go edge, and we knew that, and Walker made the most sense. I mocked them Walker in my first mock and then bounced around between other edge rushers. But for me, it was always going to be an edge rusher. I did hear a little bit of buzz about Mike Green going here very late on in the process. So I ended up shifting Shamar Stewart and Mike Green because I'd heard that the Bengals might like Stewart, but I'd also heard that the Falcons might like Stewart as well. So I kind of didn't know which one to give him, and I thought Stewart was a better player than Green. As it turns out, I heard some news about Green maybe being liked by the Falcons, which is why I swapped it around and put it this way around. As it turns out, Green fell out with character issues and Walker was available, so it all ended up working out okay. Very solid all-round player that can play off the edge or as a linebacker. Walker, entirely happy with the value here the Falcons got. Great pick by them. I thought that Walker might go to the Panthers. I'm surprised he did it based on what we heard, but this makes sense here as well. Walter Nolan to the Cards. I had him here earlier in the process in my third mock draft. That's back in March. And I was basically giving the defensive tackle nearly the whole time. I thought this was way more likely than O-line, which I saw mocked here. When the right edge rushers fell, I tried to fit him, but it ultimately weren't enough edge rushers for teams that needed edge rushers. So I had to give them defensive tackle a lot. Cornerback was always a possibility for me too, but it always just felt a little bit early. So this is always going to be a defensive tackle throughout the last four mocks for me. It was just a case of finding the right fit, and it became evident from through Walt, in fact, that Walter Nolan was definitely going to be the guy that they liked if he was there. It was either going to be here or the 49ers. So while Nolan is someone that's a little bit of a polarizing prospect, and I didn't have him in originally because I was concerned about that, it became very evident that some teams loved him and someone was going to take him in this range. And there were enough teams between the 49ers and the Cardinals and Pittsburgh and the Chargers that liked him. And I ended up mocking him to nearly every one of those teams. So very happy to see that kind of pan out. Now, while you're here, Please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. I'll be bringing out a whole heap of fantasy content in the coming days. I have been ranked very high as a fantasy expert over the last couple of years as well, top 11 in each of the last 3 years. So if I can do it with mock drafts, I can definitely do it with fantasy as well. So I hope you'll stick around and check out all our coming videos. If you've got any fantasy questions, especially around Dynasty, it is getting to that time of year where Dynasty trades are becoming a big thing. Make sure you hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My website, ffdfantasyfootball.com, will have my updated Dynasty rankings coming in the next week or two as well. Plus, we're doing a whole update of that website in general, which is slowing down the rankings a little bit. But if you've got any urgent questions, please make sure you let me know. Let's get back into the draft. Shamar Stewart's someone I really struggled with in general. I originally didn't even have him mocked anywhere because I had him in college fantasy and he was useless. It was very frustrating. I could see he was talented. I knew all the way through because I picked him up as a freshman and I thought he was going to progress and he just never did. He never did anything. There was no production at all. And I found it really hard to believe that a team would still believe they could turn him around. And yet it became very evident very quickly by February that teams did seem to think that. And so I kind of kept mocking him to one of the edge-needy teams, gave him to Baltimore at times because they tend to take players that fall. Then it became evident that he was probably going to go to the Cards or the Bengals. And as it turned out, Bengals was the right guess. Mike Green was the other guy. I regularly mocked him in this space because there was a lot of talk about him going in this range. It was really only late in the process that it became clear he was going to drop because of those character issues. I still thought that one or two teams might fall in love with him, especially the Bengals are the kind of team that will take a risk like that. But as it turns out, they took a risk on production, not a risk on character, whereas the Falcons do tend to avoid that sort of thing a lot of the time. I did also flirt with the idea of a safety here. I still think that Nick Emenwari belongs in this range. I thought he'd go somewhere in the 17 to 20-something range. Very surprised that he fell out of the first round entirely. And he can still remember back when we didn't know that T. Higgins was going to be signed because I originally gave him a wide receiver in Luther Burden, who really fell through the process. I thought that would be a good compliment to Jamar Chase. As it turns out, didn't need a wide receiver at all. In at 18 and now this pick, had this pick in for a while. Gray's Able is someone I didn't even have in my mocks initially. My concern was small arms, small school guy. I didn't really see how he was going to have such a clear fit that he'd go in the first round. To me, it seemed unlikely he was going to play as a tackle. I didn't think he was such a good guard that he needed to go in the first round, but it became evident that other teams disagreed, and in particular, the Seahawks were pretty open about the fact that they liked him or were likely to take him here. So this pick was always happening. I always expected the Seahawks to probably take an O-lineman. I gave him Matthew Golden at one stage because I did think it was a good chance that he would go somewhere in that range. And I had no idea who to mock him to. As it turns out, I got it right and worked it out. But O-line always made sense. And Zabel, this is just where he ended up. I feel like he's possibly going to end up being a slight bust in this range. I think he'll be fine. He'll probably end up being an okay interior starter, but I can't imagine he's going to pay off for the 18th overall pick. This was the first real surprise. I didn't really think it was likely to be Jahad Campbell. It's just really hard to work out who was going to take a linebacker that's as talented as Campbell. He needed to go somewhere in the first round because he is so good. As it turns out, injuries did push him down a little bit. But I didn't expect the Bucs to take a wide receiver. They've got 3 solid starting wide receivers. And if you consider that Chris Godwin isn't really a viable option because of injuries, why did they re-sign him to a massive contract? That doesn't make any sense at all. So Igbuka is someone I generally had in my first round. I dropped him out once where I was just really struggling to work out how to fit all the wide receivers in. I felt like only a couple were going to go. As it turns out, 3 did. And I ended up working out the correct 3 and roughly the right place, but I had Igbuka going about 5 spots below this. I felt like the kind of correct range for him was like early 20s. So this is a little bit of a reach anyway. As you can see, I've mocked him to pretty much every team between 21 and 26. Just could not work out the exact spot. But this made a whole heap of sense. Jahdae Barron was someone that I did not expect going to the Broncos. Sorry, I've got to change the graphic on his position. He's a cornerback, not a running back. I had them going running back the whole time. Or at least basically from throughout April in general anyway. It did seem highly likely once it became evident that Hampton was going to go in the first round that the Broncos were the most likely landing spot. Turns out that was just plain wrong. Secondary was really a need. I gave him a safety the first couple of times I did this because that is something they definitely need to target. And I think that Barron kind of makes sense as that sort of player. But to me, this is still too early for him. I originally didn't even have Barron in my mocks. Just he's too small. He's nickel specific. I didn't really understand the fit, but it did turn out that some teams liked him. And so I was willing to just slide him in and have him just be the first cornerback off the board with the Johnson issues and not worry about his exact position. As it turns out, it was here. I don't understand the pick, but it is what it is. Derek Harmon is someone that I kind of grew to love throughout the process. I didn't really have him ranked initially because I did have some concerns about his ability to produce, but it was evident the teams loved him. Once the Steelers got a wide receiver in DK Metcalf in free agency, I could stop mocking them wide receivers and start giving them defensive tackles, which became their clear need. I never really bought the idea that we might see a quarterback from them at 21. But just to hedge my bets, I did end up giving them Sanders at 32. I thought it was not impossible that they used next year's first to move back in, or potentially traded down into that region to grab one. I was pretty confident they were going to go defensive tackle or quarterback, so that was kind of just hedging my bets. And I felt it wasn't impossible. Both happened. But Harmon was someone I always thought made so much sense for the Steelers. He's just their sort of player. And I think when you look at the conversations he had with guys like Mike Tomlin, you can see that the team feels like that. As well. Also, very sad news about his mother. I hope he and his family are okay. So Harmon, now that pick did not get this pick right, though, really struggled to work out what to do with the Chargers. Defensive tackles where I kind of led throughout because they did have a clear need there, but cornerback was also somewhere I thought they'd go. I also gave them Colston Loveland at one stage. I thought tight end was a possibility. Then it became evident that Loveland was rising. Hampton, once it became evident he was going to be a first rounder after the pro days and everything else, I basically just fit him to the Broncos every single time. Did not expect him to go here. I feel like he's not a natural complement to Najee Harris, so I don't really understand what they're doing here. I think he's a more natural complement to Jaleel McLaughlin because he's kind of like that bigger back with a 3-down skill set, kind of like Harris. Not the same type of player, but certainly can be used in the same situation. So don't understand what the Chargers are doing here, but it is what it is. Matthew Golden nailed this pick, had this in relatively early, at least, had it in a couple of weeks before the draft. I did flirt with giving him a cornerback at one stage. I still do think it is a need for them. In fact, originally I gave him an edge rusher in Nick Skirden, of course, but gave him a couple of different cornerbacks, but it was just really difficult to work out what cornerbacks are even going to go in the first round. It was a lot easier to work out which wide receivers would go, and I did think there was a real possibility here. I bet quite a bit on this, in fact. And as it turns out, nailed the Matthew Golden pick. I still don't think this really makes sense. I think it's a weird pick by them. I think they needed a real alpha receiver, and Matthew Golden is not that guy. They're basically just adding another guy who is like all their other receivers. But it is what it is. It became evident it was kind of going to go somewhere in this range. So I took a little bit of a punt and got it right. This is a weird one. I had Donovan Jackson back in February because I thought it was a possibility, but it just didn't really make sense to me why an interior O-lineman would go somewhere in the first round when, firstly, there's better options in guys like Tyler Booker and Gray Zabel. And secondly, when there's not that many teams that needed one. Having said that, I did mock the Vikings Tyler Booker at one point in time. That surprised a lot of people. When I talked to people about that draft, they didn't understand what I was doing there. Turns out it was the right position. I just didn't really stick with it. I needed somewhere to put the safeties in, and it was always convenient to give the safeties a safety to the Vikings. I didn't think it was likely to happen, but it was always a possibility that they'd address the secondary, which is very weak. In fact, I think they should have done a better job of doing that. They had no real clear needs, but I felt like the secondary was the greater one. Still surprised Jackson made it to the first round, but I did at least mock him some way. There was no player that in the first round that I didn't mock in the first round, at least at some point in time. Oh, sorry about that. Jackson Dart in at 25. Not entirely shocked by this because I did have it in my last mock that he'd go to the Giants. I did not expect the Texans to drop out, though. I thought the Texans would address one of their 3 needs, which I mocked all 3 at some point in time. I originally thought defensive tackle was more likely. I also heard from Tony Pauline that wide receiver in Emeka Ibuka was someone they really liked, and this was his floor. As it turns out, he got nowhere near this point anyway, which probably part of the reason they dropped out. None of the DTs or wide receivers made it here. And clearly they just didn't like the O-lineman. Josh Simmons and Josh Connolly both available here, and they chose to go elsewhere. As it turns out, the Texans went wide receiver, which I did, as you can see, mock them a couple of times. This was unexpected, I think, that they'd go for Higgins here or just go wide receiver over O-line. But it is what it is. Clearly they felt okay with their retooled O-line that they have put together. I understand why they would feel that way, but I disagree. Dart, I don't like this pick, but it is what it is. I'm not shocked that it happened. Um, and of course, we had a trade down very next pick as well. I'm not entirely shocked the Rams trade down. In fact, I thought they probably would. In my final mock, I actually had them trading with the Vikings simply because I thought the Vikings were more likely to take MN Wari, but I thought he was more likely to go from like 26 to 30 region. So I moved them around so I could move Ikbuka up to 24. I gave him to the Rams thinking they would put him in the correct range where he'll go, even though he probably wouldn't go to that exact team. And as it turns out, that was the right move. The Rams weren't even there, so I didn't need to worry about what position they took. I did actually mock Ibuka to the Rams legitimately at one point in time. I did think that even with Devontae Adams there, it's something they might want to address. But clearly they still have a little bit of belief in the guys that they've got as well. Guys like Atwell and Whittington. They gave Atwell only 1 year, but like 10 bills. So I felt like that was more of a replacement thing. But turns out they really do believe in their wide receivers as they have them. Cornerback was something I really considered later on in the process, gave him 3 different ones. But as it turns out, they went tight end, which isn't shocking to me because I gave them 2 tight ends early. And if I'd known there was going to be one that made sense in the range they were in, definitely would have given them a tight end because Tyler Higbee will not be around for much longer. Having said that, Terrence Ferguson, wild choice. James Pierce made total sense for him to be in this range. I like him a lot. I just felt like that teams were going to have so many character issues that no one would take him in the first round. But I did see some guys like Charlie mocking him in the first round, actually quite high up in the 15-17 range to the Falcons, in fact. As it turns out, they came in and got him at 26, which seems like a pretty good move because I do think there was a team that potentially would have taken him just after that as well. Malaki Starks, now this pick, had this one a couple of times, in fact. I did feel like secondary was a possibility. Secondary or edge made the most sense for me here, but it's tough with the Ravens because they do tend to go for best player available. So it was a case of working out which player was going to fall. I felt like there was a real chance of Starks falling. Plus, I just wanted him somewhere in this range because there were a lot of teams that wanted a safety around here. Starks, for me, was always likely to go to someone like the Bills or to the Ravens, who both had needs there. And I do like the fit in particular. At 28, and Tyreek Williams shocked a lot of people. I had him up at 16 in my first mock. Not sure why. I don't really remember why I did that. I think I just had a really strong feeling that the Cardinals were going to go defensive tackle. I couldn't work out who to give them. And I felt like Williams was a possibility of going in the first round. As it turns out, he did. Didn't expect it, I admit, to the Lions. I had them going edge rusher most of the time. Eze Raku, I think, made a lot of sense to them. As it turns out, they went in a different direction. I think they really liked Tyler Booker and would have gone that way if he was available, but they weren't Williams, and it's a bit of a weird pick to me. At 29, Josh Connolly. This surprised a lot of people. I actually mocked him here only about a week out from the draft, but that was more of a just trying to fit into a spot. I didn't think it was likely to actually happen. I felt edge rusher was far more likely, potentially a wide receiver. We did hear they wanted one of them, but the guys they wanted were off the board. So I ended up giving him an edge rusher. Still surprised that Eze Raku fell out. We'll talk about that later. Connolly was someone that I had kind of as on the edge of a possible first round pick. Then it kind of became evident at times as time went on that was a real possibility. Ended up giving him to the Texans in the end, but I always thought that the Commanders were a possibility, so this was not a shock. In at 30, and this is the biggest regret I have from my huddle report draft, I so considered putting Maxwell Hairston in. I had him in the week before. I was going to leave him in there, but I just couldn't quite work out how to fit in all the players I wanted to put in. And he was the one I chose to drop out. And the reason I did is because we'd heard reports that there wasn't really a consensus on who the next cornerback off the board was going to be. And I felt like I would rather just put a player in that I was confident was going to be in the first round rather than one that might not even be in at all. But I was pretty sure that if Hairston was going to be in, there was a good chance that it was to the Bills. We had seen those two linked to each other quite a lot in the last week or two of the draft process. So that's where I ended up putting him back in my Fantasy Pros draft because I did kind of turn myself around and realize it was silly to leave him out. In at 31, and funnily enough, I had the Eagles picking at 31 in my first mock because, of course, the Super Bowl hadn't happened yet, and I thought the Chiefs were more likely to win because I'm a bit of a homer like that. I had them going edge rusher throughout most of the process. And then by the end, I couldn't even work out what they were doing. So I just had them trading their pick away to different people. But I always thought edge was a possibility. As it turns out, it's Jahad Campbell. They always go for the value. That was always likely. Love this pick for them. Campbell's someone I had going at 19, but we did hear a lot of things about him potentially being injured and falling. I just couldn't work out who to give him to. So I gave him to the Bucks, thinking that was the most likely fit. But this made sense. I definitely saw people mock him here at times. And I think with the injury and him falling, made sense he went into this range in the end. And then at 32, I had the Chiefs going Josh Simmons ages back, like very early April, nearly a month out from the draft even. I had Simmons in here. This just makes so much sense. Athletic tackle who would be way higher if not for his injury. Chiefs can afford to take a risk here. So I really do like what they did here. Finally, a couple of guys who missed out, who I did have ranked. Emin Warrior had ranked throughout. I'm still surprised that he fell. This guy's a really talented safety. I think that a lot of teams made some major mistakes by letting him go. For example, I know the Seahawks were considering taking him at 18, for example. So it's wild that he made it back to them at 35. The offensive tackle, Jonas Savaiinaea, I had him going at 32 initially. I could never really get him in after that. I did hear some buzz that he might slip into the first round. I even put like $3 on it because it was like 30 to 1 or something like that. But as it turns out, he just slipped and ended up going just outside the first round, which doesn't really surprise me. Luther Burden I had in early on, but during the draft process, it became evident he wasn't going to go in the first round. In fact, I couldn't find enough teams that wanted wide receivers to even get the 3 I wanted to mock in there. So Burden was someone I had to drop out early on. Alfred Collins I really like as a good run stuffer, but as we talked about earlier, nose tackles do tend to fall. I really like the fit of him to the Bills because they really needed someone to help them stop the run. But going just in the early second round makes a lot of sense for him as well. I'm really surprised that Eze Raku fell out. I didn't have him in there originally, but during the draft process, I heard a lot of glowing things about him from team reports and stuff like that. So I thought he'd slip into the edge of the first round. A lot of teams that I thought would value what he can do, but because I think he's a smaller speed guy, just wasn't as natural a fit, and that's why he fell. Look, JT Tuimoloau, we did hear things about him potentially going to the Lions, for example. As it turns out, they went in a different direction. But I originally had him mocked to the Eagles, who did need an edge rusher, because he was someone that I always thought was a possibility in the edge of the first round. As it turns out, it became evident during the process that wouldn't happen. Will Johnson was a real faller for me. He's got top 5 quality. I actually don't buy him to the speed issue. I think if he was healthy, his speed would be absolutely fine. I think that's total bargain getting him at 47 overall. But it did become evident throughout the process that he was going to fall. And in the end, I couldn't even fit him in my draft at all because it did seem like teams just weren't interested in taking that risk. Nick Skirden I had early on, but again, it became evident that he wasn't going to be a first-round guy, even though I feel like the talent's pretty close. Very tough with these edge rushers and cornerbacks. There's quite a few guys who are kind of on the cusp and therefore made it in at certain points in time. Benjamin Morrison, another one of those guys. Injuries played an issue here, but had him mocked in those early to mid-20s at times early on. Mike Green fell a lot, even though he actually rose throughout the process for me because I heard a lot of people saying teams liked him. Having said that, credit to Walt and Charlie from Walter Football, who were very clear that he definitely wasn't going to make it in the first round and that he shouldn't be in mocks, but I didn't listen. Put him in there anyway, and I was wrong. Trey Amos is someone I had in initially, but as much as I like him, and I actually think he's very good, became evident that teams don't as much. Same thing with Azariah Thomas. I think he's actually pretty good, but again, it became evident very early on that teams did not feel the same way. So once it got to April, I dropped him out. Siobhan Ravel, I think he probably would have been in there if not for the injury. I think he's a really good fit, but clearly the injury dropped him off a lot of boards or down a lot of boards. And that's the kind of thing it's kind of hard to predict early in the process, but it became evident that there are a lot of reports suggesting teams are concerned about that. Jordan Birch, I think I just had too early. He's not really the kind of guy that can pressure the quarterback enough to really have him up at 25. I just put my hand up, got that one wrong. Same thing with Jack Sawyer. That was more of like a personality fit. I just wanted to have an edge rusher in here. I felt like Jack Sawyer was the perfect type of guy to go to the Lions, but the production really wasn't there. Sometimes these teams get caught up with the big school guys who do a good job in the college football playoffs. And I thought that might be the case with Sawyer, but it became very evident quickly that that wasn't going to happen. Shedeur Sanders, I don't need to talk about Shedeur Sanders anymore, other than the fact that it became evident kind of 2 or 3 weeks out from the draft that he was definitely going to fall. I never really bought the idea of him going to Pittsburgh at 21. I even thought it was unlikely to go to the Saints. I just put him there because it was a heavy bookies favorite, and in the end moved it almost immediately. In fact, I even updated that 5th draft when I went on live with Walt and moved him out because I didn't like having him in there. And ended up dropping him out altogether because I thought it was likely there would be a fall. Didn't expect it to be this far, of course. And Isaiah Bond, I had in at one stage. I still think on talent he'd be close, but I'm not going to talk about his situation. It's just not productive. And that's all we've got. Please make sure you like and subscribe. There will be a heap of fantasy football content coming up. This is the last time you'll hear me talk about mock drafts until the new year. So I hope you've enjoyed mock draft season. Thank you again for all your support throughout. It's been great hearing from some of you in my DMs and stuff like that. Thank you for all the congratulations as well. As always, if you've got fantasy football questions, hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. Check out our website for the rankings that will be coming out soon. I will have some fantasy videos coming out in the coming weeks after I finish doing research. I want to make sure I'm getting it right before I get out there. Lastly, please like and subscribe. That really helps us out. I will see you on the next video.